In this video, I'm going to be going over dual booting Windows and Linux. So the purpose of this video is to educate a beginner about dual booting Windows and Linux, because when you first come into Linux, you have to dual boot just because there's going to be some things in Windows that you've left behind or you wondered how to do, and you quite hadn't learned that program in Linux yet. Such as Photoshop for me. I was constantly going back into Windows when I first started, and I eventually converted to GIMP and Krita and the freeware programs and Linux. But you need to dual boot. So let's get into dual booting. And for the purposes of this video, I'm going to be going specifically over Ubuntu-based distributions or Ubuntu dual booting. So Ubuntu is probably the most prevalent distro out there. Linux Mint is based on it, so that would also apply to it. So if you're a Linux Mint user, stay tuned. All the screens might just be a little bit different color. It'll be more grayish instead of an orange like Ubuntu, but pretty much the screens are exactly the same. And if you're doing or picking another distribution and wanting to learn about dual boot, there's still some good information in this video for you. So I'm going to go over two methods of dual booting. The first is if you only have a singular hard drive and you want to dual boot. Just know that will take up a lot of space when you have two operating systems running. So by doing this, you'll be effectively cutting your drive in half and going, hey, this half to Linux, this half to Windows. So just be aware of that. So if you're on a solid state of like 120 or 250, it's probably not going to be enough for you, but mileage will vary depending on your usage. I'm going to explain how to carve up that one drive shortly. The main thing to know here is on dual booting, Windows should be installed first if you're using a singular drive. So if you're going to carve up a one drive, Windows pretty much has to be installed first before Linux in this method. The second method I'm going to show you is the more common one I personally recommend and one I use, is having a dedicated second hard drive. This is nice because you don't have to rely on the Linux bootloader to also boot you into Windows. So just keep that in your mind when I'm going over these two methods. And with that said, let's get into it, and I'm going to go ahead and show you how to dual boot and go over any repercussions of that. Okay, we're going to start this out. I got to the screen just by inserting the Ubuntu install disks. I'm going to go ahead and go through this and get to the bootloader portion of this and just select the normal options. You can choose something else here. It doesn't matter. We're just getting to where we are actually installing the bootloader and configuring the partition. So the top option here is install Ubuntu alongside Windows 10. This is for those people that only have one disk and want to carve it up and put Linux on one half and Windows 10 on the other half. Now, for today's exercise, I'm not going to do this, but just know if you click next, you have a little slider to go back and forth. We're going to go to something else because I have a secondary hard drive where I want to put our Linux install here. Now, at the very bottom, please notice the bootloader. This is where it is installing the bootloader. You already have a bootloader with Windows. So we want to go ahead and do SDB. That's our secondary drive, which hadn't been configured yet. So that way we have a bootloader on our first drive and the second drive, so we can select which one to do in BIOS. From here, we're just going to do a new partition. And it's going to be just an ext, and I'm only doing one partition on this, just a standard mount point. I'm leaving out the swap portion of this. I highly recommend go ahead and make a swap as well, but for today's exercise, just for simplicity, we're only doing one. So after our Ubuntu, it rebooted and we're presented with this screen. However, if you don't see this and it boots directly into Windows, make sure you go into your BIOS and select your new drive that we set up Linux on. As you see from this screen, we have the option to do Ubuntu and Windows 10. When it's not selected from the actual Linux drive, it will just boot directly into Windows 10 because it's using the Windows 10 bootloader, not Grub. So just make sure, go into your BIOS and set the new drive up to boot to and make sure it has top priority. So that's all there is to it when it comes to dual booting. You really have two options for beginners out there, really two options as far as Ubuntu and Linux Mint. When you boot up, just recognize those two options. And I would show the BIOS. One, it's kind of hard to record the actual BIOS settings, and it wouldn't be much help to you. Just be sure to reference your user guides for your motherboard and make sure you set your new hard drive to a higher priority in the boot order. It's really important that you're booting from that new drive and not directly the Windows drive. Otherwise, you just won't get that grub bootloader where you can select which one to boot from. So, there are some other things I would like to go into, but I don't want to make this video too advanced. I wanted to just kind of put this out there for everyone to do, just get a basis of dual booting and having a Linux and a Windows installation on the same computer. So that's it. And my next video, probably a couple ones down the line, I'm going to go ahead and show some advanced bootloader techniques as far as loading more Linux installs onto it, and also repairing a Windows bootloader. Let's say you do overwrite your Windows bootloader. You can repair it. However, most guides online kind of suck at actually explaining how to repair it. Most of them have you just run one command or two commands from command prompt to fix it. And that's usually no good, especially if you've wiped out your bootloader doing an install from like a Linux-based system. You need to rebuild it, and I'll go in more in depth in a video, but this one I wanted to keep short and sweet, so anybody getting into Linux that needs to know about dual booting can easily do that following this guide.